The Mongolian plateau was a land of wind and silence, broken only by the pounding of hooves and the cries of eagles. It was a world both vast and unforgiving, where survival depended on the strength of the horse, the accuracy of the bow, and the resilience of those who lived beneath the eternal blue sky. It was here around 1162 that a boy was born to Yasuge of the Borjigin clan and his wife Hoilun. They named him Temujin after a defeated enemy chieftain his father had recently captured in name that carried with it the memory of struggle and triumph. Temujin's arrival came at a time when Mongolia was not a nation but a mosaic of tribes: Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Kerits, Ongirat, and countless others. Each clan had its Khan, each Khan his ambitions, and each ambition threatened to spill into bloodshed. Alliances were fragile, sealed with oaths and marriages, but easily broken by insult or betrayal. To be born into this world was to be born into perpetual contest. Yasuge, Temujin's father, was a respected but vulnerable leader. He carried the prestige of the Borjigin name and commanded loyalty from followers, but his position was precarious. On the steppe, one's power could be as fleeting as the morning frost, melted away in a single defeat, or poisoned by the treachery of neighbors. Hoilun, Temujin's mother, embodied the endurance required of a steppe woman. Once stolen as a bride by Yasuge from another clan, she had adapted to her new life with ferocity and resolve traits she would later pass on to her children. The infant Temujin was born into the rhythms of nomadic life. His cradle was the open tent of a felt ger, warmed by the smoke of a central hearth and guarded by the neighing of horses tethered outside. From his earliest days he would have been swaddled in furs, lulled to sleep by the howl of wolves across the plains. Childhood on the steppe was no gentle passage. Boys learned to ride almost before they could walk. Their small hands grasping the manes of shaggy ponies, their eyes squinting against the endless wind. The land itself shaped character. Winters were merciless with blizzards that could kill herds in a night. Summers brought dust storms and swarms of insects. Food was never guaranteed. Children grew accustomed to hunger, to gnawing dried meat when it was available, or chewing on wild roots when it was not. Strength was measured not in wealth, but in endurance, the ability to bend without breaking beneath the hardships of the land. Among the Mongols, omens and prophecies often marked the lives of great figures. Chroniclers later claimed that at Temujin's birth he clutched a clot of blood in his tiny fist, an omen of destiny, a sign that this child was fated to rule through war. Whether fact or myth, such stories reflected the awe with which his later followers looked back on his beginnings. To them, the boy born in obscurity would one day be revealed as chosen by the sky itself. And yet in those early years there was little to suggest greatness. Temujin was one child among many living in the fragile balance of clan politics. His father's alliances gave him security for a time, but danger always loomed at the edges of their camp. For every feast of horse meat and kumis, there was the threat of a raid. For every oath of loyalty, there was the risk of betrayal. But even in infancy, the world around Temujin was teaching him lessons. He saw how horses were treated with care, for they were the true lifeblood of survival. He watched how disputes were settled not by courts, but by strength and cunning. He grew in a family where loyalty was fragile, but where resilience was unbreakable. The boy who would one day become Genghis Khan began his life not as a conqueror, but as a child of the steppe, born into hunger, born into danger, born into the endless wind. His destiny was not yet visible, but already the elements of his story were gathering: the harshness of the land, the fragility of alliances, the resilience of his mother, and the memory of ancestors who had fought and bled across the same plains. Temujin's life had begun, and with it the first breath of a storm that would one day sweep across the world. Temujin's childhood, though shaped by the rhythms of the steppe, was cut short by treachery. Around the age of 9, he had already begun to step into the role expected of him. His father Yasuge had arranged his betrothal to Berta of the Ongerat clan, leaving the boy in her family's care, as custom demanded. This should have been the start of his transition into manhood, but fate intervened with brutal suddenness. While traveling home from securing the marriage agreement, Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars. Old enemies of his clan, they welcomed him with deceptive smiles, offering him food and drink. In the culture of the steppe, hospitality was sacred, a bond as strong as kinship. Yet the Tatars betrayed that bond. They laced his meal with poison. Days later, Yasuge collapsed, the life draining from the man who had once held his family's destiny in his hands. For Temujin, the loss was more than the death of a father. It was the unraveling of his world. Without Yasuge's leadership, the Borjigin clan splintered. Nomadic tribes lived by a harsh pragmatism. Loyalty was given to strength, and with Yasuge gone, the family was seen as a burden. Hoilun and her children were abandoned, cast out into the merciless wilderness with no herd, no protection, and no allies. What followed was a crucible of survival. Hoilun gathered her children close, Temujin, his brothers and sisters, and became their shield. Once a bride stolen from her people, she had learned to endure loss and upheaval. Now she hunted and foraged with fierce determination. She dug roots from the frozen earth, gathered berries, trapped marmots, and scavenged what little the land would yield. The family ate sparingly, often going hungry for days. Their lives became a rhythm of hunger and cold, a daily negotiation with death. For the children, this period seared lessons deeper than any formal teaching could. They learned to track animals in silence, to read the sky for storms, to fight over scraps when desperation demanded it. The struggle also bred conflict among them. Temujin's half-brother Bekta, older and assertive, clashed with him repeatedly. Tensions over food authority and survival boiled until they could no longer be contained. One day, when Temujin was about 12, he and his younger brother Kasar ambushed Bekta. With arrows drawn, they cut him down. The killing was not a glorious battle, but a desperate act, a child's grasp for control in a world that offered no safety. Yet in the culture of the Mongols, fratricide was a grave stain. To shed the blood of kin was to break a sacred bond, one that no oath or offering could easily cleanse. Temujin carried the weight of that act for the rest of his life. It hardened him, teaching him that authority on the steppe could not be begged or inherited. It had to be seized, even at terrible cost. Despite their desperation, there were moments of endurance that hinted at the strength of Hoilun's family. When neighbors mocked them as weak, she urged her sons to stand tall, reminding them that greatness was not measured by herds, but by resilience. Her words, delivered by a woman who had lost everything, became seeds of belief that would one day grow into Temujin's vision for a united steppe. Still, these were years of shadows. The boy who might have been a chieftain's heir became instead an outcast, a figure scraping survival from roots and wild game. He had no warriors to command, no tribe to call his own. His world had shrunk to the fragile circle of his family's campfire, flickering against the endless dark. And yet in this hardship lay a paradoxical gift. Temujin learned lessons his rivals, born into luxury and command, never would. He learned to endure when abandoned, to trust in loyalty over bloodline, to see strength in unity rather than in titles. Poverty stripped him of protection, but it gave him clarity. The world would not hand him destiny. He would have to carve it from the unyielding steppe with his own hands. The winds that howled across the plateau carried no mercy, But as they battered Helen's camp, they also forged within her son a will harder than steel. Temujin had been orphaned and abandoned, but he was not broken. The boy of the Borjigin was preparing, without yet knowing it, for a future that would rise from ashes. Temujin's early years were marked by hunger and loss, but the steppe had more trials to impose. In the fragile world of clans and shifting loyalties, weakness invited predation. As his family clawed their way through survival, rivals saw opportunity. Temujin, the son of a dead chieftain with no herd and no allies, was vulnerable prey. One day his enemies seized him. A boy, barely into his teens, he was dragged into captivity. Around his neck they locked a heavy wooden kange, a crude collar, broad and cumbersome, designed not only to restrain, but to humiliate. It marked him as powerless a slave in all but name. The weight pressed into his shoulders, making even the smallest movement a struggle. Captors paraded him through their camp, a spectacle of scorn. The message was clear: the heir of Yasuge, once feared and respected, had been reduced to nothing. For Temujin, it was more than physical torment. It was the annihilation of dignity. The boy who dreamed of reclaiming his father's place now tasted the bitter humiliation of being displayed as property. Yet even here he studied, remembered, and endured. He watched how his captors treated their own, how discipline faltered, how arrogance clouded judgment. Temujin did not despair. He waited. When opportunity came, he seized it. One night, while guards were distracted, Temujin slipped away. With desperate strength, he smashed the wooden collar against a rock until it split apart. The air that rushed into his lungs as he staggered free was more than breath, it was defiance. But survival required more than escape. Alone on the dark steppe, with enemies searching, he needed shelter. And then came an act of quiet mercy that would shape his worldview. A tribesman, risking his own life, chose to hide the fugitive boy rather than hand him back. He concealed Temujin in the reeds, shielding him from patrols until the danger passed. Temujin never forgot. This moment etched into him the conviction that loyalty and kindness must be remembered as fiercely as betrayal must be punished. Years later, when he gained power, he rewarded that man and his family, elevating them to honor. The boy in the collar learned that strength lay not only in vengeance, but in memory of both enemies and friends. His escape marked more than freedom. It was a transformation. Temujin had seen himself at the lowest point a steppe man could reach, captive, mocked, powerless. To rise from that humiliation gave him an inner resolve that no enemy could take. He understood now that survival was not enough. To avoid ever again wearing the collar of another, he would need to command loyalty, inspire fear, and build a power greater than any single tribe could muster. The experience hardened him, but it also sharpened his vision. He began to see the steppe as a chessboard of shifting alliances where strength lay in discipline and trust, not just in bloodlines. He had been abandoned by his clan, betrayed by neighbors, enslaved by rivals, and yet he lived. That resilience, born of pain, would become the foundation upon which his empire would rise. The boy who broke free from the wooden collar was no longer simply Holun's son or Yasuge's orphan. He was something new, a survivor who had seen the fragility of power and resolved to forge his own. The winds of the steppe had tested him with hunger, and now with chains. He had endured both. Soon another test would come, one that would bind him not only to a wife but to a destiny. After years of hunger loss and chains, Temujin's life reached a moment of renewal. Around the age of 16, he returned to the Ongirat clan to claim the promise made in his childhood, the hand of Berte, his betrothed. For the Mongols, marriage was never just a personal union. It was a political alliance, a joining of families that could shift the balance of power across the steppe. Berta was no passive figure in this story. Steppe women were often partners in governance, managing households, livestock, and even diplomacy, while men rode to war. Strong, intelligent, and resourceful Berta would prove to be one of Temujin's greatest allies, her influence shaping the empire as much as his campaigns. Their marriage, held in the felt-walled tents of the Ongirat, marked not only the fulfillment of an old promise, but the forging of a partnership that would endure through trials unimaginable. From this union came a gift of immense value, a black sable coat. In the material culture of the Mongols, such a gift was more than luxury. It was currency, prestige, and political leverage. Temujin understood this instinctively. Instead of keeping it as a symbol of wealth, he transformed it into a tool. Carrying the coat across the plains, Temujin rode to the camp of Togrul Khan of the Kereyet, and one of the most powerful rulers on the steppe. Years earlier, Togrul had sworn blood brotherhood with Yesugei. Now Temujin, his father's orphaned son, offered the sable coat as tribute, a reminder of that ancient bond. Togrul accepted, moved by memory and by the honor shown to him. With that acceptance, Temujin gained a powerful ally. This was the essence of Temujin's genius, not only in battle, but in politics. He knew how to transform personal ties into collective strength, how to weave relationships into a fabric of loyalty. With Togrul's support, his position among the fractured tribes grew stronger, but the steppe, ever merciless, soon tested this fragile alliance. The Merkit tribe, harboring an old grudge against Temujin's family, struck suddenly. In a night raid, they stormed his camp, seizing Berta and carrying her away. For Temujin, it was a wound deeper than any battlefield defeat. Berta was not only his wife, but the anchor of his new alliances. Her abduction threatened not only his honor, but the fragile future he was building. Desperation became determination. Temujin acted swiftly, calling upon his allies. Togrul answered, honoring the bond sealed with the sable coat. Jamukha, Temujin's childhood blood brother, also joined the campaign. Together their combined forces struck at the Merkits with overwhelming fury. The battle was swift, merciless, and decisive. Berta was rescued, returned to Temujin's tent. Her return, however, carried a shadow. Soon after, she bore a son, Yochi. Whispers spread was he Temujin's child or the son of her Merkit captor. On the steppe, where bloodlines determined legitimacy, such doubt could have destroyed Temujin's standing. Yet his response was radical. He embraced Jochi as his own, declaring him legitimate. With this decision, he revealed the principle that would define his rule: loyalty and capability mattered more than birth. In an age obsessed with pedigree, Temujin's pragmatism was revolutionary. The episode with Berta revealed much about the man Temujin was becoming. He turned a wedding gift into an alliance, a raid into an opportunity to display resolve, and a potential scandal into a declaration of his vision for leadership. Where others saw weakness, he created strength. Where others bowed to tradition, he reshaped it. Marriage, alliance, betrayal, and rescue, these events were not isolated moments, but threads in the tapestry of Temujin's rise. Berta stood at his side, not as a background figure, but as a partner who would help carry the weight of empire. And the sable coat, a simple gift, had become the first stone in the foundation of Mongol unity. Temujin's world was still fragile, but the path forward was clearer. He had a wife who stood beside him, allies bound by memory and loyalty, and the first taste of what it meant to command not just family, but nations. The raid of the Merkits and the abduction of Berta was more than a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. For Temujin, her loss struck at the core of his honor and legitimacy. A man who could not protect his own household was a man unworthy of followers. To leave her in enemy hands was unthinkable. To rescue her was not only a matter of love, but of survival. Temujin's answer was swift and decisive. Rallying his allies, he called upon Togrul of the Kherate, who honored the blood tie with Yesugei, by lending men, and upon Jamuka, his Anda, who still stood as a brother in arms. With their combined strength, Temujin launched a campaign that thundered across the plains. The Merkits, caught off guard, were no match for the disciplined force arrayed against them. Camps were burned, warriors scattered, and families seized in reprisal. Berta was rescued, returned to Temujin's Ger. Chroniclers later wrote that their reunion was marked by tears and resolve, proof of a bond that would endure every hardship yet to come. But her return also carried with it a shadow. Not long after, she bore a son, Yochi. The timing made whispers inevitable. Had Yochi been conceived during her captivity among the Merkits? Was he Temujin's blood, or another man's child? Among the Mongols, questions of lineage were no small matter. Leadership and inheritance depended on the clarity of bloodlines. A child of uncertain paternity could split loyalties, undermine authority, and fracture alliances. Temujin's rivals would later seize upon these doubts, using them to sow division among his descendants. Yet Temujin's response was extraordinary. He claimed Jochi as his son without hesitation. To him, the question of blood mattered less than the principle of loyalty. In a world where aristocrats clung to pedigree, Temujin made a radical declaration. Worth would be measured by merit, not by ancestry. If a man proved capable and loyal, he had a place at the Khan's side regardless of his birth. This decision carried immense implications. It set the foundation for the meritocracy that would become Temujin's hallmark. Warriors followed him not because of clan ties, but because of opportunity. Captives and outcasts could rise to prominence if they served faithfully. The Mongol Empire would one day be filled with generals, governors, and advisors drawn from diverse origins, men elevated not by who their fathers were, but by what they could do. Berta herself emerged from this ordeal not diminished, but empowered. Having survived abduction and return, she carried immense respect within the camp. When Temujin later rode to war, she would often oversee affairs at home, managing resources and resolving disputes. Among the Mongols, women held authority in ways foreign to many other cultures of the time, and Berta embodied this strength. She was more than a wife, she was a partner in rule. The birth of Yochi, shrouded in whispers, yet embraced by Temujin, symbolized the tension at the heart of his vision. The steppe clung to tradition, but he was already building something new. He was reshaping the old order into a system where unity outweighed clan feuds, and where the bonds of loyalty were stronger than blood. This principle would attract followers who might once have been enemies. It would also provoke resistance from those who saw in Temujin's vision a threat to their inherited power. For now, though, he had rescued Berta, claimed Yochi, and declared by his actions that the future of the Mongols would not be bound by the past. The winds of the steppe had taken much from him, his father, his clan, his safety. But in this moment they had returned something precious, a partner and a son. From this fragile foundation, Temujin would begin to build the alliances that would one day transform the steppes into an empire. For a time, Temujin's fortunes seemed to rise steadily. He had reclaimed Berta, declared Yochi his heir, and secured the loyalty of Togrul. His household grew, his campfires attracted new followers, and whispers began to circulate that this orphaned son of Yesugei might yet carve out a destiny greater than survival. At his side stood Jamukha, his childhood friend, and sworn under a bond sealed in blood and oath. Together the two young leaders envisioned themselves reshaping the steppe. But visions can diverge and bonds can sour. Jamukha represented the old order of Mongol aristocracy. He drew strength from lineage, from the nobility of his ancestors, and from the support of the traditional elite. Temujin, on the other hand, championed something radical, the promotion of men by loyalty and talent rather than birth. To him, the shepherd who proved steadfast in battle deserved more honor than a noble who faltered. What began as a subtle difference grew into a widening gulf. At first, the alliance between the two prospered. Their combined forces struck fear into rival tribes, and for a brief moment, the dream of brotherhood seemed real. Temujin and Jamukha campaigned together, sharing victories, feasts, and spoils. But beneath the surface, cracks deepened. Followers noticed the contrast between Jamukha's reliance on aristocrats and Temujin's willingness to elevate men of low birth. Warriors began to choose sides not simply between men, but between two competing visions of leadership. In 1187, the rivalry came to a head. Jamukha was declared Gurkhan universal ruler by his supporters, a title echoing the ancient Khans of Central Asia. Temujin, in turn, gathered his own Kurultai. There, under the eternal blue sky, his men lifted him upon a white felt carpet, proclaiming him Khan of the Mongols. The steppe was now divided not merely by clans, but by ideology. Two leaders, once brothers, now stood as rivals for supremacy. The clash was inevitable. At first, Temujin's merit-based army showed its strength. His men, disciplined and loyal, struck quickly and with precision, outmaneuvering Jamukha's larger but less cohesive force. For a moment it seemed the new order might triumph, but Jamukha still commanded overwhelming numbers. When the two forces finally met in a great battle, Temujin was defeated. His forces scattered, his ambitions thrown back into the dust. Jamukha's victory might have ended the story, but what followed ensured his downfall. To assert his dominance, he took 70 of Temujin's captured men-warriors who had fought bravely and executed them in a single act of cruelty, boiling them alive in cauldrons. It was a horror that shocked the steppe. Even in a land accustomed to blood, this massacre was remembered with revulsion. Jamukha had won the battle, but he had lost the moral ground. Temujin, retreating with his survivors, carried the memory like a brand upon his soul. The defeat humbled him, but the brutality steeled him. He realized that power built on fear and aristocratic privilege could not endure. True strength lay in loyalty, freely given in a leader who rewarded courage and punished betrayal with clarity, not excess. The lesson of Jamukha's cruelty would shape the code of Genghis Khan discipline, fairness and justice, harsh but never wantonly cruel. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamukha was more than a personal feud. It was a battle over the future of the steppe. Would the old aristocratic families continue to dominate, or would a new order based on loyalty, merit, and discipline replace them? That struggle would define the next decade of Temujin's rise. For now the boy, who had once been a captive in a wooden collar, was again beaten back into obscurity. Yet he had gained something far more valuable than victory experience. He had seen how easily numbers could crush the unprepared, how loyalty could outlast blood ties, and how cruelty could destroy a leader's legitimacy. These lessons would guide him through every future campaign. Temujin and Jamukha, once brothers of the blood, were now sworn enemies. And the steppe, restless as ever, waited to see which vision would prevail. Defeat at Jamukha's hands might have ended a lesser man, but for Temujin it was another forge fire. He retreated into the wilderness with his loyal corps nursing wounds and planning. The steppe was vast, and though Jamukha called himself Gurkhan, the tribes were not bound to him by iron chains. Loyalty was fickle, alliances fragile. Temujin knew that with patience, strategy and ruthlessness he could turn the tides again. The Tatars were his first target. They had poisoned his father Yasuge decades earlier, and their power remained a thorn in his side. To strike them was both vengeance and strategy. Temujin moved swiftly, launching raids that shattered their camps. Entire families were cut down or absorbed into his ranks. Unlike Jamukha's wanton cruelty, Temujin was methodical. The most dangerous Tatar leaders were executed, but the common people, women, children, artisans, herders, were folded into his growing order. By destroying the Tatars, Temujin not only avenged his father, but removed one of the most persistent enemies of the Borjigin line. But vengeance was only one step. To unify the steppe, Temujin had to face powers far stronger than the Tatars. Among them was the Karaite Confederation led by Togrul, the same Togrul who had once honored the gift of the sable coat, the man who had stood beside him in the rescue of Berta. Their bond had been real, forged in loyalty and battle. But the steppe cared little for sentiment. As Temujin's power grew, Togrul grew suspicious. Old allies became rivals, suspicion curdled into betrayal, and the blood tie withered. The conflict with the Karaite was fierce and bitter. Togrul commanded great strength, bolstered by his aristocratic prestige, but Temujin's armies were disciplined, drilled into precision by his reforms. His men fought in tightly coordinated units, obeying commands with speed that left their enemies scrambling. In the end, Temujin triumphed. Togrul was defeated and fled into exile, where he met his death. With his fall, the Karaite were broken, and many of their warriors, once enemies, now bent the knee to Temujin. Still another great rival loomed, the Nayman. Rich in herds, steeped in tradition, and long seen as heirs to the authority of earlier steppe empires, they were a formidable obstacle. To defeat them was to prove supremacy not just by force, but by destiny. The Nayman fought with courage and cunning, their ranks filled with veteran horsemen. Yet Temujin had forged something new, an army that fought as one bound by law and loyalty rather than clan. When the clash came, it was decisive. Temujin's Tumans swept across the field with coordination that stunned their foes. Feigned retreats drew the Nayman into traps. Arrows rained from horseback in unrelenting waves, and the noose of encirclement closed around them. The Nayman Khan was defeated, his people scattered or absorbed into Temujin's ranks. The dream of Nayman supremacy died on that battlefield. With each conquest, Temujin grew not only stronger, but more respected. Warriors from defeated tribes, instead of fleeing, chose to join him. They had seen the fairness with which he distributed spoils, the discipline he demanded, and the rewards he gave to loyalty regardless of birth. Slowly, tribe by tribe, he transformed enemies into allies, rivals into soldiers, fragments into a whole. Yet the unification of the steppe was not a peaceful weaving, it was a brutal process of blood and fire. Every tribe subdued was another scar, every betrayal punished with ruthless clarity. Temujin's vision demanded absolute submission, and those who resisted paid dearly. But those who joined found opportunity beyond anything the steppe had offered before. By the early 1200s, Temujin's banner flew over much of Mongolia. Jamukha's star had faded, the Tatars lay broken, the Karaite crushed, and the Nayman shattered. The steppe, long fractured, was at last bending toward unity. But victory alone was not enough. To make the Mongols more than a confederation of warriors, Temujin needed to bind them with law, ritual, and identity. The moment for a new beginning was near. At Burkan Khaldun, on sacred ground beneath the eternal blue sky, the tribes would gather to decide who would lead them all. The wars of the steppe had reached their climax. Tribe after tribe had been subdued. Tatars, Keret Naiman, and Jamukha's claim to power had faded into obscurity. By 1206, there was only one man whose strength and vision stood above all others, Temujin. Yet victory on the battlefield was not enough. To endure his authority had to be sanctified, recognized not only by the sword, but by ritual and tradition. The time had come for the tribes of Mongolia to gather in Kurultai. The Kurultai was no ordinary assembly. It was the supreme council of the steppe, a gathering where alliances were sealed, laws declared, and leaders proclaimed. On the sacred ground near Burkan Khaldun, the mountain Temujin had once fled to in his youth, praying to the eternal blue sky, for deliverance banners were raised, and camps spread out in a vast circle of felt tents. Leaders of great clans, warriors of lesser tribes, shamans and elders all came together. The fate of Mongolia balanced on the outcome. There, amid solemn rites, Temujin was lifted onto a white felt carpet by the hands of his followers. The white felt symbolized purity and legitimacy, a sacred acknowledgement that he was chosen by heaven to lead. As they raised him, high voices proclaimed him Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler. The title was no mere honorific. It marked him as sovereign not just of a tribe, but of a people united for the first time in living memory. The ceremony was steeped in symbolism. To be raised on felt meant more than earthly power. It was a declaration that the eternal blue sky itself had sanctioned his rule. Shamans invoked blessings, rituals honored the spirits of the ancestors, and offerings were made to Tengri, the god of the heavens. For those gathered, this was not only the rise of a leader, but the birth of destiny. But what made this moment extraordinary was not the ritual alone. It was the man being lifted. Temujin was no heir to an unbroken line of kings, no noble untouched by hardship. He was the boy who had once been abandoned in the wilderness, the captive who had smashed his wooden collar against a stone, the youth who had rescued his wife from raiders, the outcast who had built his power not from bloodline, but from loyalty. In his rise, the tribe saw not only the will of heaven, but the triumph of resilience. As Genghis Khan, he wasted no time in shaping the new order. At the Kurultai, he proclaimed laws to bind his people together, the Yasa, a code that regulated everything from military discipline to inheritance, hospitality, and religious freedom. He reorganized the army into the decimal system, breaking old clan loyalties by grouping men into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, so that each fought for the Khan rather than for family. The aristocrats who resisted him were cast down. Common men who had proven loyalty were elevated. It was a meritocracy carved into the flesh of tradition, a revolution disguised as reform. The Kurultai also marked the beginning of a new identity. No longer were his followers merely Borjigin Naiman or Keret. They were Mongols. A fractured world of rival clans was being transformed into a single nation under a single leader. This was not unity by consensus, but unity by submission, and yet it endured because the rewards of loyalty were real, and the fear of betrayal's punishment was absolute. For the first time, the steppe had a ruler whose authority stretched from horizon to horizon. Genghis Khan stood not only as a warlord, but as the architect of a state rudimentary by the standards of China or Persia, but uniquely suited to the nomadic world. As the Kurultai ended, the riders dispersed, carrying word to every corner of the plains. A new ruler had risen, chosen by heaven, lifted on white felt, bound by law and destiny. The tribes had been unified, But the Khan's ambitions did not end at the borders of Mongolia. His gaze turned outward toward the rich kingdoms and empires that had long dismissed the steppe as a land of raiders. The storm was about to break beyond its homeland. Genghis Khan had united the Mongols by force of arms, but he knew victory on the battlefield was fleeting if not reinforced by order. Tribes could splinter again, rivalries could reignite. To hold his new nation together, he needed something stronger than fear and more enduring than conquest. He needed law. Thus emerged the Yasa, a body of decrees and customs that became the backbone of Mongol rule. Some of its origins were drawn from ancient steppe traditions, others from the Khan's own vision, but together they formed a code that bound his people into a single fabric. Though never written in his lifetime, the Yasa was memorized and enforced with iron discipline carried in the minds of his commanders and the voices of his officials. The Yasa was uncompromising. Theft, betrayal, and desertion were punishable by death. Warriors were forbidden to abandon their units. Adultery was condemned, disputes settled with strict justice. Hospitality remained sacred. To harm a guest or envoy was to defy the will of the Khan himself. Yet alongside these harsh decrees stood policies of remarkable tolerance. Freedom of religion was guaranteed. Shamans, Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and Nestorian clerics all enjoyed protection. For Genghis Khan, loyalty to him mattered more than loyalty to any god. But law alone was not enough. The Khan reshaped the very structure of society. The ancient bonds of clan and lineage were broken apart. No longer would warriors fight only for family or aristocratic kin. Instead, the army was reorganized into the decimal system units of 10 Arban 100, Jaghun, 1,000 Mingun, and 10,000 Tumen. Men from different tribes were deliberately mixed, forcing them to depend not on kinship, but on comradeship under the Khan's banner. It was a radical act dissolving centuries of tribal loyalty into a new allegiance, personal loyalty to Genghis Khan. At the center of this new order stood the Keshig, the imperial guard. These men were chosen not for noble birth, but for absolute devotion. They served not only as protectors, but as companions, eating at the Khan's table, sleeping near his tent, carrying his commands. To be named to the Keshig was the highest honor, proof that even a humble herdsman could rise to the heart of empire if his loyalty was unwavering. Communication, too, was transformed. Genghis Khan understood that an empire could not survive without speed. He expanded the Yam, a vast courier network that stretched like arteries across the land. Relay stations stood at intervals of a day's ride, stocked with fresh horses and provisions. A rider carrying a message could cover hundreds of miles in a matter of days, his authority marked by a paisa, a tablet of the Khan. In time, this system would carry not only orders, but merchants, envoys, and travelers, binding the empire into a connected whole. What made these reforms extraordinary was not simply their effectiveness, but their philosophy. Genghis Khan had seen the futility of relying on bloodlines alone. His own clan had abandoned him after Yesugei's death, yet strangers had shown him mercy. He never forgot. Thus he elevated men on the basis of loyalty and ability. Generals like Subutai, once of humble origins, rose to command tens of thousands. Artisans, scribes, and administrators from conquered lands were folded into service, valued for what they could contribute rather than where they had come from. For those who resisted, the law was merciless. For those who submitted, the rewards could be immense. The combination of strict justice, ruthless punishment, and generous reward created a system that was both feared and respected. Warriors knew that their Khan demanded everything, but also that he gave back in measure. This was the genius of Genghis Khan's new order. He transformed the steppe from a patchwork of clans into a disciplined state, from a landscape of shifting feuds into a machine capable of projecting power across continents. The Yasa, the decimal system, the Keshig, and the Yam, together they formed the bones and sinews of an empire still in its infancy, but already more resilient than any confederation before it. The boy who had once been abandoned to hunger now commanded a system that could hold thousands in obedience. The survivor in the wooden collar had become a ruler whose voice could echo across mountains and deserts, carried by riders swift as the wind. And soon that voice would be heard far beyond Mongolia. The Khan, having forged unity and law at home, now turned his gaze outward. The kingdoms and empires along his borders, wealthy, walled, and proud, were about to learn the strength of the Mongol order. The Yasa had given the Mongols law, but it was their army that gave them destiny. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan commanded the most disciplined and fearsome fighting force in the world, an army that seemed less like men and horses than a living storm, swift and unstoppable. From childhood, every Mongol boy was raised in the saddle. Riding was second nature, archery a daily ritual. By the time a youth became a warrior, he could loose arrows accurately at full gallop turn in the saddle to shoot behind him and endure weeks of hardship with little more than dried meat and fermented mare's milk. Each man rode with multiple horses, switching mounts to keep them fresh, allowing the army to travel up to 100 miles in a day, unthinkable by the standards of sedentary kingdoms. Their weapon of choice was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering crafted from wood horn and sinew. Small enough for horseback use, yet powerful enough to pierce armor, it could send arrows flying with deadly accuracy over distances that stunned their enemies. Each warrior carried a quiver heavy with arrows of different types, broadheads for unarmored foes, bodkin points for piercing mail. Against cavalry, infantry, or fortress walls, the Mongols always had the right arrow for the kill. But it was not the weapons alone that made them formidable, it was the way they fought. The decimal system of organization imposed by Genghis Khan meant every man knew his place. Tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands moved like parts of a single body. Orders could pass swiftly across the field through signals of flags, drums, or torches, ensuring coordination at a scale that bewildered enemies used to chaos once battle began. Their tactics blended patience and ruthlessness. Feigned retreats became their signature move. A Mongol force would charge, unleash arrows, and then wheel away as if in panic. Pursuers, confident in victory, broke formation to chase them, only to be lured into ambushes where hidden tumans closed in from the flanks. Entire armies vanished in this trap, their courage turned against them. Encirclement was another favored tactic. The Mongols spread their riders across vast arcs, herding enemies like hunters, driving game, tightening the circle until no escape remained. Against fortified cities they displayed equal cunning. Though born of the steppe, they were quick learners of siegecraft. From Chinese engineers they absorbed the use of catapults, battering rams and towers. From captured artisans they mastered techniques of mining beneath walls or hurling incendiaries. Cities that once felt safe behind stone found themselves exposed to a people who could adapt with frightening speed. Psychological warfare amplified their victories. Rumors of Mongol cruelty often reached a city before the army itself. Those who surrendered were often spared their lives, preserved artisans and merchants put to use. Those who resisted faced annihilation. Populations were slaughtered or deported, pyramids of skulls left as grim warnings. The logic was brutal, but effective surrender brought survival. Resistance invited obliteration. Word of these choices spread along trade routes faster than any army, causing many to capitulate without a fight. Discipline held it all together. Desertion meant death. Looting without permission brought execution. Yet rewards were equally strict. Spoils were distributed according to contribution, not noble birth. A shepherd who had fought bravely could find himself richer than an aristocrat who hesitated. This fairness, rare in the ancient world, bound men to their Khan as tightly as fear. Even in the heat of conquest, Genghis Khan remained pragmatic. Skilled artisans, scribes and specialists were never wasted. Captives who could contribute to the empire's growth were spared and relocated. Chinese engineers, Persian scribes and Arab doctors all found themselves woven into the fabric of Mongol rule. This willingness to integrate the knowledge of others gave the Mongols a technological edge that multiplied their natural strengths. To their enemies, the Mongols seemed like a force of nature appearing suddenly moving with impossible speed, striking with precision, then vanishing into the horizon. To chroniclers in Europe and the Middle East, they were the scourge of God, the horsemen of apocalypse. But behind the terror lay order. The storm was not random, it was disciplined, calculated, and commanded by a leader whose vision extended beyond raiding to empire. By the time Genghis Khan's army stood ready, the Mongols were no longer a scattered people of tents and herds. They were a weapon honed to perfection, tempered by years of hardship, sharpened by reform, and unleashed with terrifying efficiency. The question was no longer whether they could conquer Mongolia. That had already been done. The question now was what kingdoms beyond the steppe would fall when the storm broke over their walls. With the steppe united and his war machine perfected, Genghis Khan turned his gaze beyond Mongolia. The nomads had long raided the settled kingdoms to the south, but now for the first time they would march as a unified empire. The first target lay on Mongolia's southern border, the Tangut kingdom of Western Sia. Western Sia was no tribal confederation. Its rulers commanded walled cities, fertile river valleys, and a disciplined army that combined Chinese-influenced infantry with steppe cavalry. Their strongholds were built of stone and earth, formidable fortifications that mocked the mobility of nomadic horsemen. To conquer such a kingdom was to prove that the Mongols could not only sweep across open plains but break through the walls of civilization itself. The campaign began with ferocity. Mongol riders surged across the frontier, burning villages, cutting supply lines, and forcing the Tangut to retreat into their fortified cities. Yet here, the Mongols faced a challenge unlike any they had seen before. Their bows and speed meant little against walls that loomed above them. For a time, it seemed the Khan's momentum had met its limit. But Genghis Khan adapted. He ordered the construction of siege engines, catapults, rams, towers crafted by captured engineers and local craftsmen. His men diverted rivers to flood defenses, cutting off supplies until the defenders starved. When resistance stiffened, he turned to psychological terror, demonstrating the same ruthless calculus he had honed on the steppe. Villages that resisted were annihilated, their fate a warning to others. Those who surrendered quickly were spared and integrated into the Mongol system. The Tangut fought bravely, but the Mongols' persistence and adaptability wore them down. By the end of the campaign, Western Sia submitted, agreeing to pay tribute and provide troops to the Khan. For the Mongols, this victory was more than a conquest. It was a trial by fire, a demonstration that even stone walls could not stop them. For the Tangut, it was a lesson in the consequences of defiance. Yet this alliance was uneasy. The Tangut rulers, resentful of their humiliation, harbored thoughts of betrayal. Years later, they would test Genghis Khan's patience and pay for it with the destruction of their kingdom. But for now, their submission marked the first expansion of the Mongol Empire beyond the grasslands. The conquest of Western Xia also revealed something deeper about Genghis Khan's vision. He was not content to raid and retreat as his ancestors had done. Raiding brought plunder, but conquest brought permanence, resources, manpower, knowledge. The Mongols were learning to be more than steppe warriors. They were becoming an imperial force. The soldiers who returned from the Tangut campaign carried more than loot. They carried the knowledge that their army could adapt to siege warfare, that foreign specialists could serve the empire, and that submission could be as valuable as slaughter. These lessons would echo across every future conquest from China to Persia. The storm had tested itself against the walls of civilization and found them wanting. Now, emboldened by victory, Genghis Khan's gaze turned to a greater prize, the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, one of the wealthiest empires in the world. The Tangut campaign had proven that the Mongols could humble a kingdom of walls and cities, but Genghis Khan's ambitions reached higher still. To the southeast lay the Jin dynasty rulers of northern China. They commanded immense wealth, vast armies, and fortified capitals. For centuries, steppe tribes had alternately raided or served as vassals to the Jin. Genghis Khan intended to end that cycle. The Mongols would not bow, they would conquer. In 1211, he launched his first great campaign. Tens of thousands of horsemen surged across the frontier in 3 coordinated thrusts, a maneuver that demonstrated the precision of his new military machine. The Jin outnumbered the Mongols many times over. Chroniclers speak of armies exceeding 300,000, but sheer size meant little against mobility and discipline. Mongol scouts mapped the terrain, spies infiltrated towns, and deception became a weapon as potent as the bow. On the open field, the Jin forces were undone. Their heavily armored cavalry, formidable in close combat, found themselves harried from afar by swarms of arrows. When they advanced, the Mongols scattered in feigned panic, only to wheel back and envelop them. When they retreated, the Tumans pressed relentlessly, striking their flanks and rear. What seemed like chaos was in fact orchestration, and the Jin armies bled away under the endless storm of hooves and shafts. By 1213, the Mongols had cut deep into Jin territory, seizing strongholds and forcing the emperor to flee south. The countryside burned, cities capitulated or perished, and panic spread across the dynasty. The Mongols advanced methodically, reducing resistance with fire and terror. The Jin tried to buy peace with tribute, but Genghis Khan had learned from the fate of Yesugei that half measures invited betrayal. He demanded submission, not negotiation. The climax came in 1215 when the Mongols encircled Zhongdu, today's Beijing. The siege was brutal and unrelenting. Catapults hurled stones and fire-sapping morale within the walls. Supplies dwindled, famine and disease spread, and corpses piled in the streets. At last, the city fell. Chroniclers describe streets running with blood fires, consuming palaces, and terrified survivors herded into slavery. Zhongdu, one of the jewels of northern China, had been reduced to ashes. Yet even in destruction, Genghis Khan's pragmatism showed. Artisans were spared and relocated, scholars employed, and merchants encouraged to resume trade under Mongol protection. What he destroyed with one hand, he rebuilt with another, reshaping the remnants into tools of empire. The Mongols were not merely raiders who vanished with plunder. They were conquerors who absorbed what they conquered. The fall of Zhongdu did not end the Jin dynasty, which retreated southward and lingered for decades. But it shattered their prestige, severed their northern holdings, and announced to the world that the Mongols were no longer steppe marauders, but a rising imperial power. The great wall of civilization had cracked, and through it poured the riders of the north. For the Mongols, this was a revelation. The wealth of China, grain, silk, iron, paper, and artisanship was now within their grasp. Each conquest made the empire richer, stronger, more sophisticated. Siegecraft, once borrowed from foreign engineers, became second nature to Mongol generals, and for Genghis Khan the war against the Jin was more than victory, it was vindication. The boy abandoned in hunger, the youth who broke free from a slave's collar, had humbled one of Asia's most powerful dynasties. The Jin were crippled, but Genghis Khan was not done. Beyond them lay another kingdom, the Kara-Kitai guardians of Central Asia, whose downfall would open the road to Persia. Even as northern China reeled under Mongol assault, Genghis Khan's ambitions widened westward. Beyond the deserts and mountains of Central Asia lay the Kara-Kitai, also known as the Western Liao, a remnant of a Chinese dynasty that had once ruled the north before being driven west by the Jurchen Jin. In exile, they carved out a new empire stretching across Central Asia, presiding over a mosaic of Turkic tribes, Persians and Muslims. Though smaller than their former glory, the Kara-Kitai still stood as a formidable power. They controlled trade routes linking China with Persia, taxed caravans laden with silk and spices, and fielded armies that mixed Chinese-style infantry with Turkic cavalry. Their ruler, Kuchlug, was ambitious but ruthless, a usurper who had seized power by marriage and intrigue. For Genghis Khan, their existence was both a threat and an opportunity. They blocked the western routes his merchants sought to travel, and Kuchlug's harsh rule, particularly his persecution of Muslim subjects, made him deeply unpopular. If the Mongols could remove him, they could gain not only territory, but the loyalty of oppressed peoples eager for relief. To accomplish this, Genghis Khan turned to one of his most brilliant commanders, Yebe. Known as the Arrow, Yebe was a man of humble birth, elevated by merit, famed for his cunning as much as his ferocity. With a relatively small force, Yebe launched a campaign of both military pressure and political subversion. Instead of storming fortresses head-on, he moved like a shadow across Central Asia, striking, suddenly retreating swiftly and spreading rumors of Mongol invincibility. More importantly, he promised religious freedom and protection to Muslims under Kara-Kitai rule, contrasting Mongol tolerance with Kuchlug's oppression. Town by town, loyalty shifted. Armies meant to resist instead surrendered. Leaders who once feared Mongol arrows now opened their gates, seeing in them a chance for relief from tyranny. The campaign reached its climax in 1218. Yebe cornered Kuchlug in the Pamir Mountains, cutting off his escape routes. Betrayed by his own people, the usurper fled, but he was captured and executed. With his death, the Kara-Kitai state crumbled. The Mongols moved swiftly to consolidate their hold. They did not plunder indiscriminately. Instead, they secured trade routes, reassured towns, and folded artisans and administrators into their system. Caravan roads reopened under Mongol protection, and merchants found passage safer than it had been in generations. For the first time, the empire's influence touched the edges of Persia. The fall of the Kara-Kitai was more than another conquest, it was a statement. The Mongols had not only destroyed an empire, but had done so by wielding both force and diplomacy. They had shown themselves capable of winning battles with arrows and with promises, with terror and with tolerance. This duality, ruthless destruction for resistors, unexpected generosity for those who yielded, would define their strategy across Eurasia. With the western gates now open, the Mongols stood at the threshold of a new and even greater challenge, the Khwarezmian Empire. A confrontation born not from ambition alone, but from an insult so grave that it would unleash one of the most devastating campaigns in history. By 1218, the Mongol Empire stretched from the forests of Manchuria to the deserts of Central Asia. Trade flowed under Mongol protection, and Genghis Khan saw in this exchange not only wealth but the chance to bind distant peoples together. To the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful state ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, spanning Persia, Transoxiana, and parts of Afghanistan. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, were jewels of commerce and culture. At first, Genghis Khan sought peace. He sent a caravan of 450 merchants laden with silk, silver, and fine goods offering trade and alliance. But the Shah's governor at Otrar saw opportunity in treachery. Claiming the merchants were spies, he seized them, plundered their goods, and executed them. When Genghis Khan, enraged but still cautious, sent 3 envoys to demand justice, the Shah answered with an insult that would seal his empire's fate. 1 envoy was killed. The other 2, humiliated, their beards burned before being sent back. On the steppe, envoys were sacred. To violate them was to defy the very order of heaven. Genghis Khan responded not with negotiation, but with war, total and uncompromising. In 1219, he assembled perhaps 200,000 warriors, the greatest host he had ever commanded, and unleashed them westward. The campaign that followed was a catastrophe for Khwarezm, a storm of annihilation without precedent. Otrar, where the caravan had been murdered, was besieged. When it fell, the treacherous governor was executed in a manner as memorable as it was brutal, molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment as symbolic as it was terrifying. Bukhara was next. The city, famed for its scholars and mosques, capitulated after a brief siege. Genghis Khan entered its great mosque mounted on horseback and addressed the terrified citizens. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was plundered, its artisans deported, its defenders slaughtered. Samarkand, one of the greatest cities of Central Asia, resisted longer but met the same fate. Its walls were breached, its defenders overwhelmed by Mongol precision. The Shah fled westward in panic, leaving his people to their fate. Urgench and Nishapur fell with even greater ferocity. Chroniclers speak of pyramids of skulls erected outside the ruins of tens of thousands slaughtered in single days. Though medieval sources exaggerate archaeological evidence, confirms that vast stretches of Transoxiana were depopulated, irrigation systems destroyed, and cities reduced to rubble. The Mongols waged this campaign not merely for vengeance, but with a ruthless logic. By obliterating centers of resistance, they cleared the way for their cavalry to move freely. Fields once filled with crops were turned to pasture for horses. Skilled artisans were deported eastward to enrich Mongolia and China. Merchants were spared and protected, ensuring that trade, once secure, would resume under Mongol control. The Shah himself became a fugitive, hounded across his collapsing empire. Pursued relentlessly, he fled into the Caspian Sea's islands, where he died in 1220, broken and abandoned. His son Jalal ad-Din fought bravely against the Mongols but could not stem the tide. At the Battle of the Indus in 1221, Genghis Khan's forces crushed his army, and only by leaping into the river and swimming across did Jalal ad-Din escape. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a wealthy and powerful state, was reduced to ashes within 2 years. Its fall sent shockwaves across the Islamic world and into Europe. To many it seemed as if an unstoppable force had risen from the east, a scourge sweeping away kingdoms as though they were but dust before the wind. For Genghis Khan, the destruction of Khwarezm was not only vengeance for insult, but a demonstration of absolute power. No envoy would ever again be harmed without consequence. No city would dare resist without remembering the fate of Samarkand and Nishapur. The Mongol name was now synonymous with annihilation, and the world trembled. Yet, even as he dismantled Khwarezm, Genghis Khan was already looking further. To the west beyond Persia lay new lands, Georgia, the Caucasus, and the steppes of the Rus. And to test them, he sent 2 of his greatest generals, Jebi and Subutai, on a journey that would become legend. Even as the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled under Mongol fury, Genghis Khan unleashed one of the most audacious military expeditions in history. He entrusted 2 of his finest generals, Jebe the Sharp Arrow, and Subutai the master strategist, with a reconnaissance mission unlike any other. Their orders were simple in wording but vast in scope: ride west, test the strength of foreign kingdoms, and return with knowledge. What followed was a campaign of astonishing distance destruction and daring. With perhaps 20,000 men, Jebe and Subutai rode into the Caucasus. Their army was small compared to the massive hosts of Persia or China, yet it was highly mobile, disciplined, and lethal. They moved like wind and shadow, appearing suddenly, vanishing just as swiftly, and leaving trails of ruin in their wake. In Georgia and Armenia, they encountered well-armed Christian kingdoms defended by knights and fortified towns. The Mongols adapted, striking quickly, avoiding prolonged sieges and devastating open-field armies. When resistance stiffened, they withdrew, only to reappear where least expected. The Georgian armies, proud and confident, were broken. Again and again, their discipline no match for Mongol deception. Pushing further north, the generals crossed into the steppe lands where Cumans and Kipchaks roamed. These Turkic nomads, distant cousins of the Mongols, at first resisted, then fled westward seeking refuge with the princes of Rus. Their warnings of the horsemen from the east fell on ears both proud and skeptical. The Russian princes, fragmented yet determined, assembled a coalition, believing numbers and valor would suffice against the invaders. The confrontation came in 1223 at the Kalka River. The combined armies of Russes and their Cuman allies outnumbered the Mongols. Yet Jebe and Subutai had no intention of meeting them head-on. Instead, they deployed their signature tactic, the feigned retreat. The Mongols engaged briefly, then turned and fled, luring the coalition into a long pursuit. For days the Russes chased what they believed was a fleeing enemy. Discipline frayed, formations broke, and exhaustion set in. Then at the chosen moment the Mongols turned. Hidden Tumans swept in from the flanks, encircling their pursuers. Panic spread through the Russes' ranks as arrows rained down. Whole contingents were cut apart in isolation. Commanders killed soldiers, slaughtered as they tried to flee. Chroniclers describe a massacre without mercy, with tens of thousands left dead on the field. The princes who were captured were executed in a grim ritual laid beneath planks, while Mongol victors feasted atop them, their ribs crushed slowly as they suffocated. It was both punishment and message: resist and terror will follow. After Kalka, the Mongols did not remain. Their mission was never to conquer Europe, not yet, but to scout and destabilize. Having sown terror across the Caucasus and the Russes, they turned back east, completing an arc of over 5,500 miles, one of the longest continuous campaigns in medieval history. They returned to Genghis Khan with invaluable knowledge: the weaknesses of kingdoms to the west, the disunity of the Rus, the terrain and resources of the Caucasus, and the vulnerabilities of European knights. The effect of their ride was profound. To the people of the Caucasus and Rus, the Mongols seemed like a supernatural force, appearing from nowhere, destroying entire armies and then vanishing. Their name spread in whispers, a warning of storms to come. To Genghis Khan, the reports confirmed what he already suspected: beyond Persia and the Caspian lay lands ripe for conquest. Jebe, the man who had once shot the arrow that killed Yesugei's horse and entered Genghis Khan's service as penance, had proven his worth again. Subutai, still young in his career, emerged as a genius of maneuver and deception, destined to lead Mongol armies deep into Europe in years to come. The long ride was more than reconnaissance. It was a rehearsal for future conquest, a warning shot fired across Eurasia. The Mongols had tested kingdoms and empires, and none had withstood them. By the time Jebe and Subutai returned east, Genghis Khan's empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Persia. Yet the Khan himself was not finished. He still had wars to fight in China, rebellions to punish in the Tangut lands, and new frontiers to imagine. The storm was still gathering, and when it turned west again it would fall not on scouts but on the full might of the Mongol war machine. The long ride of Jebi and Subutai had been a preview, a whisper of the storm to come. By the 1230s, under the leadership of Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son and successor, the Mongols turned their full attention to Europe. This time it was no raid or reconnaissance. It was invasion deliberate and overwhelming. The campaign began with the subjugation of the Rus. In 1237, a massive Mongol host under Subutai and Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, swept into the forests and plains of the east. Their strategy was precise and merciless: isolate cities, cut them off and reduce them one by one. Ryazan fell first, its population slaughtered after refusing to yield. Vladimir followed, engulfed in fire. By 1240, Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, lay in ruins. Chroniclers spoke of streets running, red churches burned, and survivors dragged into captivity. The Mongols did not linger to rebuild. They pressed onward west into Poland and Hungary, testing the strength of Latin Christendom itself. In 1241, two battles fought within days of each other seared the Mongol name into European memory. At Legnica in Poland, Duke Henry II assembled knights, infantry, and allies from across the region. Confident in their armor and heavy lances, the knights charged, but the Mongols answered with smokescreens, volleys of arrows, and feigned retreats. Confusion spread, cohesion broke, and the knights were cut down piecemeal. Duke Henry was slain, his head displayed on a spear. The flower of Poland's nobility was annihilated in a single afternoon. Even as Poland reeled, the Mongols struck Hungary. At the Battle of Mohi, King Belafor commanded one of the largest European armies of the age. His men fortified themselves behind wagons and controlled the bridge over the Sajo River. Subutai, however, had prepared a masterstroke. While one force attacked the bridge, another built hidden pontoons downstream. At dawn, Mongols struck from both crossings, enveloping the Hungarians. Panic erupted as arrows fell in deadly showers. The wagon fort meant as refuge became a trap. Fires spread, suffocation and chaos followed, and when the Mongols feigned a retreat, desperate soldiers rushed out only to be massacred in the open. Tens of thousands lay dead, Hungary broken in a single day. After Mohi, nothing stood between the Mongols and the heart of Europe. The road to Vienna lay open, and beyond it the kingdoms of Germany, France, and perhaps even Rome itself. Chroniclers wrote in terror of a second apocalypse, horsemen from the east, sent as God's punishment. Panic spread through monasteries and courts, alliances hastily formed, crusades preached against the invaders. And then suddenly the storm receded. In December 1241, word reached the Mongol commanders Ögedei Khan had died in Karakorum. By tradition, all royal princes had to return for the Kurultai to elect a new great Khan. Subutai, in the midst of planning the march into Austria, turned his horse eastward. The army withdrew across the steppe, leaving behind only ruins and terror. To Europeans it seemed a miracle. Chroniclers credited divine intervention, believing God had spared Christendom. But the reality was harsher. The Mongols had not been defeated. They had left on their own terms, their conquests unfinished. The memory of what they had done and what they might return to do haunted Europe for centuries. In the east, the Mongols consolidated their hold. The Golden Horde under Batu emerged as the westernmost Khanate, ruling the steppe north of the Black Sea and demanding tribute from the princes of Rus. For Eastern Europe, the Mongol yoke would shape politics, trade, and identity for generations. The campaign into Europe revealed the full power of Mongol warfare. Armies thought invincible had been destroyed in days. Stone walls crumbled, cavalry charges shattered, coalitions dissolved in panic. The Mongols had shown that no corner of the world was beyond their reach. Yet even as Europe trembled, another transformation was beginning. The Mongol conquests had brought death, yes, but they also paved the way for an unexpected era of peace and exchange. The same riders who burned cities now patrolled caravan routes. The same empire that spread terror would soon spread trade knowledge and ideas across continents. The storm was giving way to calm, the Pax Mongolica. When the hoofbeats finally faded and the fires of conquest cooled, something unexpected emerged from the ashes. From China to Hungary, the Mongols had carved an empire without precedent, vast, connected, and terrifyingly efficient. Yet in its wake came not only destruction, but a new kind of order. Historians would later call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For centuries, Eurasia had been divided. The Silk Road, that ancient artery of trade, had withered under the weight of banditry, rival kingdoms, and fractured states. Caravans dared not risk the journey. Knowledge and goods trickled slowly across the continent. Under the Mongols, all of that changed. Where the storm had passed, silence and safety now reigned. The heart of this new order was the yam, the relay system of horses and stations that stretched like a web across the empire. Built first to carry the Khan's commands, it became the lifeline of Eurasia. At each station, fresh mounts and provisions waited. Couriers could travel hundreds of miles in days, a speed unmatched in the medieval world. A traveler bearing a paisa, a tablet of Mongol authority, could command assistance wherever he went. In time, merchants, diplomats, and even missionaries rode these same roads, shielded by the Khan's protection. Trade flourished. Chinese silk, porcelain, and paper moved westward. From Persia came glass medicines and metalwork, spices from India, jewels from Central Asia, and furs from the Russian forests filled caravans. The Mongols, pragmatic and hungry for wealth, taxed these exchanges but safeguarded them. Bandits were hunted mercilessly. Roads once perilous became secure. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Eurasia felt the stirrings of a unified market. But it was not just goods that traveled. Ideas, technologies, and religions crossed the empire with unprecedented freedom. Gunpowder, first a Chinese innovation, made its way west to reshape the battlefields of Europe. Paper money spread, transforming economies. Medical knowledge flowed in both directions. Islamic physicians brought treatments east, while Chinese herbal remedies traveled west. Astronomical instruments, navigational techniques, and agricultural methods passed from one culture to another, fertilizing civilizations far beyond the Mongol heartland. Religion, too, enjoyed a rare tolerance. Genghis Khan's Yasa had declared freedom of worship, and his successors upheld it. Buddhist lamas, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and shamans all found protection in Mongol lands. In Karakoram and later Khanbalik, debates were held between clerics of different faiths before the Khan himself. The Mongols, pragmatic in all things, sought wisdom wherever it could be found. Their empire became a meeting ground of beliefs, a crossroads of ideas, as well as goods. Travelers marveled at what they found. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan envoy, described Karakoram as a cosmopolitan city where artisans from across the empire worked side by side. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, carried back tales of wonders in China, grand cities, efficient roads, and wealth beyond imagination. His accounts, half fact and half legend, would ignite Europe's imagination and inspire generations of explorers. Administration under the Mongols was equally pragmatic. They ruled as nomadic overlords but left local systems largely intact. In China, they employed Confucian scholars. In Persia, Islamic bureaucrats. In Rus, native princes. The Khans demanded tribute and obedience but allowed conquered peoples to manage daily affairs. This mixture of nomadic supremacy and local governance kept the empire functional across its vast expanse. For a generation, the Pax Mongolica created something rare in medieval history, an interconnected world. A merchant could journey from Venice to Beijing under one authority, paying tribute along the way, but traveling in safety. A scholar from Persia might debate with a Buddhist monk in Mongolia. A Christian envoy could ride the same roads as a Muslim trader. The world was for the first time bound into a single system, yet this peace was fragile, enforced by the memory of terror. Cities remembered what happened to those who resisted. Bandits knew that death awaited those who threatened caravans. The Mongol peace was not gentle, it was peace by the sword. But in that uneasy calm, commerce, culture and knowledge bloomed in ways unseen for centuries. The empire that had begun with fire and blood was now knitting together the threads of civilizations. The storm had become a bridge. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe, the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Yet no empire, however vast, is immune to time. What the eternal blue sky had raised the storms of history would wear down. The first fractures came from within. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his sons and grandsons inherited an empire built on conquest. For a time, they maintained unity. Under Ögedei, the Mongols pressed deeper into Europe. Under Mongol and Kublai, they conquered the Song dynasty of southern China. But ambition breeds rivalry, and family bonds that once bound the empire together frayed into civil war. The greatest division came in the 1260s when Kublai Khan, ruling from China, clashed with his brother Arik Bokeh in a brutal succession struggle. Kublai prevailed, but his decision to shift the capital to Khanbalik, modern Beijing, distanced him from the steppe. To many Mongols, the Khan had become too Chinese, abandoning the ways of their ancestors. Steppe warriors who once roamed free now felt alienated under the shadow of a city's walls. Meanwhile, costly failures tarnished Mongol invincibility. Twice they launched fleets against Japan in 1274 and 1281, only to be smashed by typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds. In Vietnam and Java, jungle warfare and disease humbled their armies. These defeats showed the limits of their power and drained their resources. Nature dealt an even harsher blow. The Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons, reducing pasture for horses. And then came the Black Death. In the 1340s, plague spread along the very trade routes the Mongols had secured. Caravans carried not only silk and spices, but rats and fleas. Populations collapsed from China to Europe, and the arteries of empire clogged with death. One by one, the great Khanates splintered. In Persia, the Ilkhanate flourished culturally under rulers like Ghazan, who embraced Islam but fragmented after 1335. The Chagatai Khanate split between its eastern nomadic half and its western, increasingly Islamic half. The Golden Horde ruled Rus for centuries, but fractured into rival hordes as Moscow rose to defy them. In China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai's heirs faced rebellion, famine, and inflation. By 1368, the Red Turbans rose in revolt, and the Ming dynasty expelled the Mongols from Beijing, driving them back to the steppe. Yet decline did not erase their legacy. Timur Tamerlane revived the dream of steppe conquest in the late 14th century, claiming descent from the Mongol line. His empire, though short-lived, inspired the Mughal dynasty in India, whose name itself derived from Mongol. In Mongolia proper, the northern Yuan endured, transformed by Altan Khan's embrace of Tibetan Buddhism, shifting energy from endless conquest to monastic life. By the 17th century, Mongol independence waned as the Manchu Qing dynasty absorbed their lands, while Russia expanded into the former domains of the Golden Horde. The world the Mongols left behind was forever altered. Turkic languages spread widely across Central Asia. Genetic studies reveal that a lineage linked to Genghis Khan himself survives in millions of men today. Administrative practices pioneered by the empire, the postal relay census-taking systematic taxation, were adopted by Russia, China, and beyond. Borders, ethnic mosaics, and trade corridors still echo their migrations and conquests. Most of all, the Pax Mongolica created connections that reshaped history. The transfer of crops technologies and ideas across Eurasia prepared the ground for the Renaissance and the age of exploration. Without Mongol roads, Marco Polo might never have reached China. Without Mongol trade, Europe might never have encountered gunpowder or printing so early. Even the Black Death, catastrophic though it was spread through the arteries, the Mongols had opened, transforming societies in ways still felt today. The memory of Genghis Khan himself remains divided. In Mongolia, he is revered as the founding father, his face on currency, his name a rallying cry of national identity. Elsewhere, he is remembered as a scourge. Cities burned millions, dead pyramids of skulls left as monuments to terror. Was he destroyer or creator tyrant or unifier? The answer perhaps is both. For what cannot be denied is this: from a boy abandoned in hunger, orphaned and enslaved, rose a man who reshaped the world. He built an empire of horses and iron law and loyalty, fire and fear. He unleashed storms that toppled kingdoms but also stitched together the threads of Eurasia into a single tapestry. The hoofbeats have long since faded from the steppe, but their echoes remain. The empire is gone, yet the world it left behind, connected, transformed, and haunted by memory, endures. And in the quiet winds of Mongolia, beneath the eternal blue sky, the name of Genghis Khan still rides.